Hi, my name is Ed with LEHR Gardens, and I wanted to share with you this garden here that I've built. I've been building LEHR Gardens for about 10 years now, and this is definitely the most advanced garden that I've built. And I wanted to kind of talk you through what makes this garden special. Um, I'm here at the LEHR Urban Farm in the Levine area in Phoenix, Arizona. It is August 8th of 2023. We're basically at the tail end of a record-breaking heat wave here. Pretty much every day in the month of July was over 110 degrees. This garden was actually planted at the end of June, mostly from seed. And so this growth that you see behind me has happened at a time when most people think that you really can't grow in that kind of heat. And this actually, as you can see, it's thriving. So before I really jump into what this garden does specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit about LEHR Gardens for those of you who are new here and aren't familiar with the concept. So LEHR Garden is an acronym. LEHR is an acronym for Linking Ecosystem and Hardware for Regeneration. And basically what that means is that we have it's an engineered system. It's a garden. It's a whole comprehensive closed loop ecosystem garden system that uses the technology, the hardware, in conjunction with the biology. The biology processes are really key that really run the system, and the hardware is there to really kind of create the conditions that are going to enhance and accelerate those processes. So in terms of the basic functionality of it, this particular garden is the biggest one that we currently built. It is 24 feet long, it's 4 feet wide, so it's about 196 square feet. So we start off at the far end over here. There's a compost bin there. We put food waste, plant waste, anything biological that we want to break down. We just go ahead and put that in the compost bin. When the water turns on for its automated watering cycle, the water flows first into that compost bin. Anything that's broken down, any of those nutrients that are released, are taken up into the water, and then they flow through. So the garden's got a little bit of a slope to it. This is the low end, that's the high end. The water flows through the soil. Those soil organisms that are in there take up the nutrients and deliver them to the plants. The water then drains back down. There's a tank, a 70-gallon tank underneath this end here, so the water, whatever the plants don't use, just gets filtered, recaptured, and then on the next pumping cycle it pumps back up and reuses that water. So it's a closed loop system. The soil itself is really where the magic happens. So we have the soil is about 90% wood chips. We put a little bit of finished soil on top so that we have a plantable surface, and so that it kind of helps us inoculate it with the right microorganisms, because it's the soil that we've taken out of other LEHR gardens. But again, the bulk of that soil is wood chips, and over time those wood chips break down into, it starts to look like soil in about a month. At 6 months, it's mostly soil. And at 100 months, it's almost, or 100 months. At 1 year, 12 months, it's almost completely soil. There's very little of the original wood chips that are left. And that process of breaking down the wood chips, what it does is it feeds those soil organisms. And those soil organisms then will break down those wood chips. They'll collect the nutrients. They'll feed them to your plants. The presence of those organisms is incredibly beneficial for your plants. And it does just a bunch of really, really cool things. So this garden in particular, we've made other gardens like this, but one of the ways that this garden is special is, I don't know if you can see it in here, but we have screens underneath the garden right here. And living underneath the garden are quail. So this is a Coturnix quail. We have right now about 60 of them living underneath the garden. And that does a couple of things. That does a couple of things that are really amazing for the garden. The first is it produces an additional output. We get meat and eggs out of this. Coturnix are almost the ideal urban food source. You know, they produce twice the volume of eggs. You know, if you were to crack them and put them in a measuring cup, you'll get twice the volume of the eggs for the same space, square footage, as you would for chickens. But they're also can be used pretty easily as a sustainable source of meat. They're not loud. You can see there's 60 of them right here, and they're not really making any noise at all. They do sometimes. They have a slight crow, but it's not loud. It's not as offensive as chickens. The egg production is really one of the big things. Even with this heat wave that we've got going on right now, the birds are a little bit stressed from the heat, but they're getting enough protection here that they're actually laying about 12.5. If all of the hens were laying and doing it on a regular basis, we'd probably get to 3 to 4 dozen eggs a day. Right now we're getting about 12.5, so a little under half of them are laying. But considering how hot it's been, I'm perfectly happy with that. As it cools off, they'll start laying more. We're already working on breeding the next batch so that we can increase the flock. So in terms of the coop, how does the coop work? So a LEHR garden, because the water has to be pumped up and drained down, we have to raise the bed a little bit. And it creates a space. You know, it's just as easy. We have to waterproof the whole thing, so it has to have a bottom anyway. So it's just as easy to raise the bed up off the ground, which creates a space as it would be to try and build it on the ground. But that creates a space underneath the garden that's kind of a wasted space, a potentially wasted opportunity. And so what we did here is we just built a cage under here that supports the quail. Now, before we got this finished in late June, it was starting to get really hot here. We had a cage for them that was outside. It was shaded. They were in a somewhat exposed place, kind of like they are here. But it was just shade above them, and they were extremely heat stressed. They weren't laying eggs. We were losing a fair number of quail just to the heat. Putting them in here, we haven't lost a quail in here in a couple of weeks, and ever since we basically got the systems all kind of settled out. And basically what's happening, the reason it's so much better here is because not only do they have this thermal mass sitting on top of them, which provides better cooling than just shade, but that thermal mass, because of the water that's flowing through it, we actually use the water flow to cool the water, and then as the water flows through it, it helps keep the whole garden a little bit cooler. And so the quail are very much benefiting from that. So it's actually a really good beneficial system for the quail. Now, one of the things that's sort of challenging about quail is that they don't ever go broody. These are domesticated quail. They don't ever go broody. They just lay eggs pretty much constantly, and they also don't necessarily recognize nesting boxes. At the far end here, we have a little pit that we created to kind of be a nesting box, and they do lay most of their eggs in that area, but we do also get eggs throughout. And so what we did for the bulk of the run is we built the screen at a little bit of a tilt, and so if they lay eggs there, they just roll over to one side, and we have doors there that we can grab it and collect the eggs. At the far end over here, the last 6 feet, which is over the tank, we created a flat spot. And so the flat spot allows us a little bit easier place to put the food. This is the feeder that we have. It's basically just an open pipe. We pour the food in here. I don't even have to get into the cage to check the food supply or feed them, but it comes down and it has an L over and has little holes where they can feed without. Quail are notorious for kicking their food everywhere, and so these little holes that they stick their head in don't really give them the opportunity to kick the food out. We would have a huge pile underneath here of loose food if it wasn't that way, and we don't have that. So that's working really, really well. We also have the drain of the garden comes over here. I'll turn this a little bit. So we have the water that drains, and we have uh, the water drains. It comes through the quail cage, drains out on top of the screen that they walk on, and actually we put a little sheet pan. For those of you who are thinking about growing quail in the heat, I'll explain how we're keeping them cool. So what I did is I went down to Goodwill, and I bought a little cookie sheet. It's only about a half an inch deep, and I put it under the drain, and the water as it flows through the garden drains onto that cookie sheet. It just pours off one of the corners of the cookie sheet down into the tank. But the quail can walk around in there, and it cools off their feet, which helps cool off their body, which helps keep them comfortable. So that part's working really, really well too. And so by having a water source, a food source, a coolant source, all down at this side, and then a flat surface where they're a little bit more comfortable to walk, the quail have a tendency, typically when I come out here, about 3/4 of the quail are sitting down at this end, right over the tank. And as they poop, it falls right through the screen down into the tank. And then the bacteria in the tank will help process that. We got an aerator that just kind of keeps that water flowing and oxygenated. And as those nutrients are added to the water, what happens is the water pumps back up to the compost end again, and then it flows through the garden. And so all of those nutrients, and quail manure is basically as nutrient dense as it's pretty equivalent to chicken manure. But we don't need to compost it first. It's partially being processed by the biofilm, the bacteria that's in the water, and it's partially being processed by the soil organisms. One of the big problems with putting wood chips in is that as the wood chips decompose, they absorb a lot of nitrogen, which can rob that from your plants. And you can see, squash, this is mostly the big plants are mostly zucchini, and squashes are heavy feeders. They like a lot of nitrogen, a lot of phosphorus, a lot of potassium, and they're obviously getting that despite the fact that their roots are down in wood chips. And so we have this this kind of closed loop system where we're just providing incredible fertility, mostly automated. Now you can kind of see it over here. We have a space underneath here, and basically what that's going to allow us to do is, because the screen there is sloped, we were able to leave that space open, and as that space fills up with quail manure, we're just going to take a shot back and get under there and suck it out and add that to the garden, or probably some of the gardens that don't have the quail underneath them, because we are getting just a ton of fertility being added constantly. Now, one of the things that I hear a lot from people is, because you've got the water source, and we do put fish in there. I've already added goldfish to this. Primarily, what the goldfish do is in this case, they will actually eat the quail manure. They'll also eat any bugs, insects that land up in the garden, in the water. They'll help keep mosquitoes down. They're very beneficial to the system. But one of the comments that I constantly get is that a LEHR garden is basically just another form of aquaponics. And it's not. First of all, the fish, we don't put enough fish in there to provide those nutrients in the way that aquaponics would need them. But also, the primary source of nutrients isn't the fish. And even if we don't have the quail here, the garden itself still runs. It'll get nutrients from the wood chips. It'll get nutrients from the compost that you're putting in. There's just a bunch of different ways that a LEHR garden will get its nutrients. What a LEHR garden is at its core is a composting method. This is probably the most fancy, useful compost bin in the world. It's basically all it is. And so back to those wood chips that I was talking about, as those slowly break down, they eventually, the particle size, it goes from big and chunky and loose with lots of pore spaces, but that particle size gets smaller and smaller as we get the combination of fungal action and bacterial action and earthworms and all of those different soil organisms living through their life cycles and making do with all of those amazing nutrients, all of that energy that's stored in the wood chips. So you think about, if you take a pile of wood chips and set them on fire, they'll burn just fine. That energy that's released in heat is all the energy that's stored that powers the metabolic processes of the organisms in the garden. But as those particle sizes, as those wood chips get broken down, the particle size gets smaller and smaller, and the water doesn't flow through here as well anymore. And what will happen is, as it starts to get waterlogged, the soil itself goes anaerobic. It shuts down the beneficial processes in the soil. It fires up some harmful processes in the soil, and it'll actually slow down the growth of the plants. And we don't want that to happen. So the one of the only real significantly big maintenance aspect of a LEHR garden is typically once a year in most gardens, but this one I'm pretty much going to have to do it twice a year. I might actually end up having to do this one because of the richness of the quail manure that's going through. I might actually have to 3 times a year come in and harvest the soil. And what we do is we let it dry out for a couple of days, and then we pull all the soil out, we sift it, and we put wood chips back in and some of that finished sifted soil, and basically just rebuild it right back to the way it was when we started working on it. Now, the advantage of that is that soil is incredibly valuable. Currently, I'm selling it for about $10 a gallon, and this garden here, at the farm here, we're building 12 of these eventually. I've got 4 that are running currently. This is the only one that has quail, but we're going to be building 12 of these, and at the rate that they put out soil, and at the rate, if I do 2 harvests a year, I'm looking at probably somewhere in the general neighborhood of about $40,000 a year worth of soil produced here. And the soil is incredible. We're working on getting some testing to really nail down the qualities of it. It's such a rich organic living soil that the typical laboratories aren't really going to tell us much beyond the nutrient levels, which we already know are very, very high. For example, one of the tests that we got on one of our soils, I compared the micronutrient levels to azomite, which azomite is something that you add about a half a cup per 100 square feet in a garden. It's something that you do a very, very light application, and it's specifically for adding some of those micronutrients in. And on all but like 1 or 2 of the micronutrients, our finished compost was higher in those nutrient levels than azomite was. So it's definitely very, very rich. It's also incredibly biologically active. We've got a local tree guy who takes our soil and he uses it to create a compost tea that he uses to spray down the fruit trees for his customers. And he said the results that he's seeing are just absolutely incredible. And a couple other growers that I've talked to, growing microgreens or seed sprouts that have used this, just say they can definitely see a huge difference. And again, back to, and these are, this is a new garden bed. I haven't harvested soil out of this. And so what I'm really hoping is that with this just constant influx of quail manure, this is automated with every pumping of the water, that we're going to see an even richer, final soil than what we normally do. So, we're really going to kind of punch it up in terms of soil creation. And like I said, normally we can harvest it at 3 months or at 6 months. But I'm actually thinking we might want to harvest this one about every 4 months, because the influx of those nutrients is going to help those wood chips break down faster. If we can get a high enough population of earthworms in there to really get in there and do their work, then we're going to see just incredible breakdown of this. And potentially, again, if I can get 3 harvests instead of 4 at the same volume, it goes from $40,000 a year to $60,000 a year. And so it's definitely something that has a potential to be just incredible food producing powerhouse. And of course, this is going to produce hundreds, if not thousands, of pounds worth of food. That's one of the big purposes of this demonstration site, is to really kind of nail down how much food that we can produce. I mean, just the little bit of numbers that I've gotten from not really trying very hard. I always say I'm a better engineer than I am a gardener. And some of the things that I have found, it's like I call my farming method benign neglect. I'm just not very good at harvesting. I'm not very good at turning the garden over on time. I'm not very good at planting for maximum productivity. I just sort of harvest what I want, and even what I've gotten just off of that level of harvesting has been, some pretty impressive numbers. And so, working really hard to kind of maximize productivity here. I have high hopes. Certainly come follow us on our website, lehrgarden.com. We've got a blog section, and I'm going to start up a blog post at the end of August 2023 for basically the farm report. And so every month we'll drop the data of how many pounds of food we produced, how many gallons of soil we produced, how much water we used, all of that kind of stuff. And all of that's going to help us really kind of dial this in. Because one of the things that we're hoping to do is this, like I said, this garden is 100 square feet. It doesn't take up that big of a footprint. And what we're hoping to do is to really revolutionize urban farming. It's not something that I've really talked about a lot. I'm trying to figure out, really, it's a big topic. Got to figure out where to start. I think I'll be shooting a video on that fairly soon. I'm certainly working on a very large blog post about that, which I hopefully have out very soon. But definitely stay tuned. We've got a lot to say. There's a lot of cool things. If you're into regenerative agriculture, urban regenerative agriculture, stay tuned. Come on back. Subscribe to the channel. I'm going to try and be putting out a little bit more content lately. Certainly got a lot of exciting things to show you and talk about here. Thank you so much for listening.